My daughter-in-law handed me a plastic laminated badge that read, "Observer" in bold black letters, and told me I did not have a seat at my own dining table. She smiled that practiced sugary smile of hers and said that because I was 70 years old and retired, I wouldn't understand the high-level business they were discussing. She thought because I had handed over the CEO title to my son, I had also handed over dignity. She thought I was just a senile old man who would shuffle off to the kitchen and eat leftovers. She was wrong. She didn't know that by the time she wiped the lobster bisque off her $5,000 designer dress, I would have already initiated the sequence to bankrupt her entire family and reclaim my empire. I am Harrison Caldwell, and this is the story of how I taught the parasites living in my house a lesson about ownership that they will never forget. Before I continue this story, take a second to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone who actually pays the bills. The windshield wipers of my SUV were fighting a losing battle against the Sierra Nevada snowstorm as I navigated the winding roads up to Lake Tahoe. It was New Year's Eve. Most people my age would be tucked in bed or watching the ball drop on television, but I was driving through a blizzard to be with my family. I had built that lakefront property 20 years ago with money I earned from pouring concrete and bending steel. It was my sanctuary, a place I intended to leave to my son Brandon and his family. Since my wife Martha passed away 3 years ago, the silence in my main residence had become deafening, so I looked forward to these gatherings. I thought I was driving home to warmth, to laughter, to the people I loved. I had no idea I was driving into an ambush. When I pulled into the heated driveway, I noticed 2 cars I didn't recognize. Luxury sedans, brand new, parked right in the spots usually reserved for family. I keyed the code into the front door, and the warmth of the house hit me, carrying the smell of roasted truffle and expensive champagne. I shook the snow off my coat and walked toward the dining room. The sight that greeted me froze my blood colder than the storm outside. The dining room table, a 12-seat mahogany masterpiece I had commissioned in Italy, was set for dinner. But at the head of the table, in the chair that had been mine for 2 decades, sat Richard. Beside him was his wife Linda. They were my son's in-laws, Tiffany's parents. Richard was holding a crystal glass of my oldest scotch, leaning back as if he owned the place. They were laughing loudly, their faces flushed with alcohol and arrogance. My son Brandon was sitting halfway down the table, his head bowed low over a plate of lobster, looking like a servant in his own home. And then there was Tiffany, my daughter-in-law. She was standing by the sideboard directing the catering staff with snapping fingers. When she saw me standing in the archway, dripping melting snow onto the hardwood, her expression didn't show warmth or welcome. It showed annoyance. She walked over to me, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. She was wearing a silver gown that probably cost more than my first car. "Hello, Dad," she said, her voice dropping an octave to mask the irritation. "We didn't expect you to brave the storm." I looked past her at the table. I saw Richard, Linda, Brandon, and 2 other men I didn't know. Every chair was taken. There was no place set for me. "I see you have a full house," I said, my voice raspy from the cold. Tiffany blocked my view, stepping side to side to keep me from approaching the table. "Yes, well, that is actually what we need to talk about," she said, putting a hand on my damp shoulder. "Tonight is a working dinner, Dad." Richard and Linda brought some very important investors to discuss the expansion of the company. It is high-level strategy, complicated stuff. We didn't want to bore you with it, especially since you are retired now and out of the loop. I looked at her hand on my shoulder, then at my son. "Brandon," I called out. My son looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but Tiffany cut in. "Brandon agrees with me, Dad. We need to focus. You know how stress is bad for your blood pressure at your age." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a lanyard. It was a cheap plastic thing on a nylon string. Inside the plastic sleeve was a card with the word "Observer" printed on it. She slipped it over my head before I could react. "Here," she said, patting my chest. "You can sit in the armchair by the fireplace. You can watch and observe, but please don't interrupt the adults while we talk business. The kitchen staff will bring you a tray in a bit." The humiliation was physical. It felt like a slap. I looked at the tag hanging against my chest. Observer. In my own house. At a dinner paid for with my money. I looked at Richard. He raised his glass of my scotch and smirked. To the great observer, he toasted loudly. Let's hope he stays awake past 9 o'clock. The table erupted in laughter. Linda giggled, covering her mouth with a napkin. Even the strangers chuckled. Only Brandon remained silent, shrinking further into his chair, looking at his lobster, as if he wished he could disappear into the shell. I stood there for a moment, the heat of the fireplace on my back, the cold of the betrayal in my heart. I looked at this house. I remembered laying the foundation. I remembered the day I signed the deed over to the trust, making Brandon the CEO, but keeping the land in my name to save them taxes. I had given them everything. I leased this mansion to them for $1 a year so they could live like royalty. And this was my repayment. A plastic badge and a seat in the corner. Something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. The clarity of a man who realizes he has been feeding a tumor. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I simply reached up and pulled the lanyard from my neck. I stepped forward, bypassing Tiffany, and walked straight to where she was sitting. A bowl of hot, creamy lobster bisque was waiting at her place setting. I looked her dead in the eye. She looked confused, her smile faltering. "Dad, what are you doing?" she started to ask. I dropped the plastic badge into her soup. It landed with a heavy splash. Thick orange bisque exploded outward, coating the front of her silver dress, splattering onto the white tablecloth, and flecking Richard's expensive suit jacket. The silence that followed was absolute. Tiffany gasped, looking down at her ruined gown in horror. Richard stood up, his face turning purple. "Are you crazy, old man?" he shouted. I ignored him. I ignored Tiffany's screeching. I looked only at my son. "Brandon," I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the room like a razor. "The lease is terminated." Brandon went pale. "Dad, please," he stammered. "It is New Year's Eve." "Not anymore," I said. I turned my back on them. I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. Tiffany was screaming that I was a senile old fool. Richard was yelling about dry cleaning bills. I walked back out into the storm. The cold wind felt good now. It felt clean. I got into my truck and engaged the four-wheel drive. As I drove away from the mansion, leaving the warm glow of the windows behind, I didn't feel lonely. I felt like a hunter who had just set a trap and was waiting for the prey to step in. They thought I was just an observer. They were about to find out that I was the one holding the demolition switch. The heater in my truck rattled against the silence of the cabin as I navigated the treacherous switchbacks leading down from the mountain. The snow was falling harder now, turning the world outside into a blur of white and gray, but my mind was focused on the past, dissecting the precise series of mistakes that had led me to this frozen highway on New Year's Eve. It wasn't just bad luck. It was bad judgment born of grief. When my wife Martha died 3 years ago, I felt a part of my own ambition die with her. I looked at my son Brandon, and I saw the only piece of her left in this world. I wanted to give him everything. I wanted to make his life easier than mine had been. That was the first fatal error. A father's job is to make his son strong, not comfortable. I remembered sitting in the lawyer's office signing the papers that handed the operational control of Caldwell and Sons over to him. I made him the CEO. I gave him the title, the corner office, and the prestige. I kept only one thing for myself, a detail that Brandon and his wife Tiffany had clearly glossed over in their rush to pick out new curtains for the executive suite. I retained the ownership of the land and the physical assets, The factories, the warehouses, and most importantly, the lakefront estate they were currently partying in. To save them from a massive inheritance tax bill, I had structured a lease agreement. I rented the property to the company for $1 a year. It was a standard tax avoidance strategy, a way to keep the money in the family. But in my desire to be clever with the IRS, I had handed my home to people who treated it and me with contempt. I realized now, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, that the lease had a termination clause. It was a standard boilerplate paragraph on page 42 that allowed the landlord to revoke the agreement for conduct detrimental to the property or the owner. Throwing the owner out into a blizzard certainly qualified as detrimental conduct. The neon sign of a Motel 6 flickered ahead, a beacon of cheap reliability in the storm. It was the only place open this far down the mountain. I pulled into the parking lot, which was mostly empty save for a few long-haul trucks and a beat-up sedan. This was a far cry from the heated driveway and the valet service at the mansion, but it felt more like home to me than that nest of vipers ever would. I turned off the engine and took a deep breath of the freezing air before stepping out. I walked into the lobby, stamping the snow off my boots. The night clerk was a young woman with tired eyes watching a portable TV on the counter. She looked up, surprised to see an old man in a tuxedo jacket covered in snowflakes walking in at midnight. "I need a room for the night," I said, my voice rough. "Just a single." "Ground floor if you have it." She nodded and typed something into her computer. "That will be $89 plus tax," she said. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my American Express Centurion card. The black card. It was made of titanium and heavy enough to break glass. It was a symbol of unlimited spending power, a card that could buy a jet if I wanted it to. I placed it on the counter. She swiped it. A moment later, she frowned. She swiped it again. "I am sorry, sir," she said, looking at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. "The machine says the card has been declined. It says to pick up the card. It has been reported lost or stolen." I stared at the little gray machine. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw an automated email from the bank. It was a notification that a secondary authorized user, Brandon Caldwell, had flagged the primary account as compromised and requested an immediate freeze on all physical cards. I almost laughed. It was a tactical move. A petty, vicious tactical move. They knew I was driving into a storm. They knew I would need a hotel. They wanted to make sure I had no resources. They wanted me to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness, begging for a warm bed. They wanted to break me. The clerk was looking at me nervously now, her hand inching toward the phone, probably thinking I was some senile old grifter with a stolen credit card. I didn't get angry. I didn't argue. I simply bent down and unlaced my left boot. The clerk's eyes widened. I reached into my sock and pulled out a thick, tightly rolled bundle of cash. $2,000 in hundreds. It was a habit from my days working construction in the 70s. You never know when a machine will break down or when you will need to bribe a building inspector. Cash is king. Cash does not require a signal. Cash does not get declined. I peeled off a $100 bill and placed it on the counter. "Keep the change," I said. She took the money, her hands shaking slightly, and handed me a plastic key card. "Room 104, row. Down the hall to the left." The room smelled of lemon cleaner and stale cigarettes. The carpet was thin, and the heater rattled louder than my truck, but it was warm. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my watch. It was 2 in the morning. In Zurich, Switzerland, it was 11 in the morning. Most people think their local bank branch controls their destiny. They think if they cut off the credit card, they cut off the man. But wealth, true wealth, operates on a different level. I had a private banking relationship that predated Brandon's birth. I dialed a number that wasn't stored in my contacts list. I had memorized it 20 years ago. It rang twice. A voice answered, crisp and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." How may I assist you today? It was George. He wasn't a call center employee. He was a senior director who handled only 10 clients. George, I said, we have a security breach on the domestic family accounts. I need to initiate protocol verify. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Understood, sir. Please provide the voice authentication phrase. The winters are long in Tahoe, I said. Verified, George replied instantly. What are your instructions? I want a complete freeze on all subsidiary credit lines attached to the Caldwell Trust, I said, my voice calm and cold. Specifically the unlimited supplementary cards issued to Brandon Caldwell and Tiffany Caldwell. Set their spending limit to 0, effective immediately, and George flagged their social security numbers for potential identity theft review. It will lock them out of opening new lines of credit for at least 48 hours. Consider it done, Mr. Caldwell, George said. Is there anything else? Yes, I said. Transfer $500,000 from the main operating account to my personal holding account, the one they cannot see, and then revoke their viewing access to the family trust portal. I want them blind. Done, George said. The changes are propagating through the system now. They will be effective in approximately 10 minutes. Have a good night, Mr. Caldwell. I hung up the phone. I lay back on the stiff motel pillows and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. I imagined the scene that would play out in a few hours. It would be New Year's Day. They would wake up in my house hungover and self-satisfied. They would probably try to order an expensive brunch catering service, or perhaps Tiffany would try to buy something online to make herself feel better about the soup stain on her dress. And the card would decline. Not just one card, all of them. The gas cards, the grocery cards, the emergency cards. They would call the bank, and the bank would tell them they were locked out pending a security review that could only be cleared by the primary account holder. Me. They had tried to strand me in a snowstorm with nothing. Now they were about to find out what it felt like to be royalty with no treasury. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I slept deeply comforted by the knowledge that the freeze had officially begun. The real winter was coming for them, and they didn't even have a coat. The heater in the motel room rattled and coughed, struggling against the freezing morning air, but the cold I felt had nothing to do with the temperature. My phone vibrated against the cheap laminate nightstand, dancing with a frantic energy that filled the small room. It was 7 in the morning on New Year's Day. I looked at the screen. Brandon. My son. He had called 12 times in the last 20 minutes. I picked up the phone not to answer, but to silence the ringer, then I set it back down and watched the screen light up again. He left a voicemail. I pressed play, holding the phone away from my ear, as if it were contaminated. Dad, pick up, please. His voice was high and tight, practically vibrating with panic. Look about last night. Tiffany had too much champagne. She didn't mean it. It was just a joke that went too far. And listen, Dad, something is wrong with the accounts. The waiter just tried to run the card for the breakfast catering deposit, and it came back declined. The bank says the cards are reported lost. It has to be a system error because of the holiday. You need to call them. You need to fix this. We have guests here, Dad. We can't look broke. Please come home. We will take care of you. I ended the message and deleted it. We will take care of you. The phrase hung in the air, dripping with irony. They wanted to take care of me the way a wolf takes care of a wounded deer. They didn't want my forgiveness or my presence. They wanted my credit limit. The sheer panic in his voice confirmed that George in Zurich had executed my orders perfectly. The financial freeze had hit them, and the parasites were already gasping for air. But panic wasn't enough. I needed to see the extent of the rot. I dressed in the same tuxedo jacket and trousers from the night before, now wrinkled and stiff, and walked out into the gray, biting morning. I didn't head back to the lake house. Instead, I pointed my truck toward the city, toward the industrial park, where the heart of Caldwell and Sons beat. The roads were empty, the city nursing a collective hangover, but my mind was sharp, focused on the hunt. I pulled up to the main gate of the headquarters 40 minutes later. I had designed this facility myself, pouring the foundation with my own crew 30 years ago. Now, a new security guard booth stood at the entrance, manned by a kid who looked barely old enough to shave. This was Tiffany's doing. She had fired Old Man Miller, my trusted guard of 20 years, claiming we needed a more professional image. The kid stepped out of the booth, holding up a hand to stop my truck. He looked annoyed at the interruption. "I am sorry, sir. The facility is closed for the holiday," he said, barely glancing at me. "No visitors allowed without prior authorization from the CEO." I looked at him. I could have told him I owned the asphalt he was standing on. I could have called Brandon and forced him to clear me. But that would tip my hand. If this guard called the house to verify, they would know I was making a move. So I didn't say a word. I simply nodded, put the truck in reverse, and backed away, playing the part of the confused old man they thought I was. I drove around the block and turned into the alley behind the complex. The front door was for show. The back door was for work. I parked behind a dumpster and walked through the snow to the heavy steel loading bay door of the supply warehouse. It was secured with a digital keypad and a biometric scanner, expensive toys Brandon had installed. But next to it, hidden behind a stack of rusted pallets, was a small maintenance door. It was the original entrance to the first shop I ever built. It didn't have a scanner. It had a deadbolt. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my key ring, finding the old brass key I had cut myself 3 decades ago. It slid into the lock smoothly. I turned it, and the bolt clicked back with a heavy, satisfying sound. I slipped inside, the smell of grease, cold concrete, and metal dust filling my lungs. It smelled like work. It smelled like truth. I moved through the silent warehouse, navigating the maze of shelves and heavy machinery in the dark, my footsteps silent on the concrete floor. I made my way to the service elevator in the back corner, bypassing the main lobby entirely. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. It was eerily quiet, the plush carpet absorbing sound, the emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows down the hallway. I walked toward the corner office. My office. Or what used to be my office before I handed the keys to Brandon. I expected the floor to be deserted. Who works on New Year's Day? But as I approached the heavy double doors at the end of the hall, I saw a sliver of light spilling out onto the floor. The door was ajar. I slowed down, pressing myself against the wall. I could hear a voice inside. It wasn't Brandon. It was deeper, rougher, filled with a gravelly arrogance that made my stomach turn. It was Richard, my son's father-in-law. I peered through the crack in the door. The sight made my blood boil. Richard was sitting in my chair. Not just sitting. He had his feet clad in expensive loafers propped up on the leather surface of my desk. He had opened the display cabinet where I kept my private reserve. A bottle of 50-year-old single malt whiskey. A bottle I had been saving for a moment of true victory was open on the desk. It was half empty. Richard held a tumbler in one hand and his phone in the other. He was on speakerphone. "Don't worry about the credit cards, honey," Richard said, slurring slightly as he took a swig of my whiskey. "It is just a glitch. Brandon will fix it Tuesday. The important thing is that the old man is finished." I held my breath. I recognized the voice on the other end. It was Linda, his wife. "Is it done, Richard?" she asked. "Are we sure?" "It is done," Richard laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He walked out into a blizzard. He probably froze in a motel somewhere. But even if he comes back, it doesn't matter. Brandon signed the order last week. "What order?" "The competency review," Richard said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "We have the doctor lined up. He is going to testify that Harrison has advanced dementia, paranoid delusions, aggressive behavior, that little stunt with the soup last night. Perfect evidence. It proves he is unstable." I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. They weren't just stealing my money. They were plotting to steal my life. They were going to lock me away. "So what is the timeline?" Linda asked. Monday morning, Richard said. As soon as the banks open. Brandon already authorized the transfer. $5 million from the corporate reserve account to the shell company for the consulting fees. We call it the Metaverse Resort Investment. By the time anyone realizes the project is fake, the money will be in the Caymans and Harrison will be in a secure memory care unit drooling on himself. $5 million. That was the company's entire liquidity. They were going to drain it dry in a single transaction. Are you sure Brandon is okay with this? Linda asked. Brandon does what Tiffany tells him to do, Richard sneered. And the boy is weak. He doesn't have his father's spine. Thank God for that. If Harrison was 10 years younger, he would have killed us for sitting in this chair. But he is old. He is tired. And by next week, he won't legally be a person anymore. We win, Linda. The empire is ours. I stood there in the hallway, the shadows wrapping around me. I watched him defile my desk, drink my whiskey, and plan my destruction. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to kick open the door and break him. But I stopped myself. Violence would only prove their point. If I attacked him, I would be the unstable old man they claimed I was. No. I needed something better than violence. I needed proof. I turned and headed for the server room. Richard was right about one thing. Brandon was weak. But he was wrong about me. I wasn't tired. I was just getting started. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the doorframe, the wood groaning softly under the pressure of my restraint. Every fiber of my being, every instinct honed by 70 years of fighting for what was mine, screamed at me to kick that door open. I wanted to march in there and wrap my hands around Richard's throat. I wanted to drag him out of my chair and throw him through the plate glass window. The image of his smug face, the sound of his wet, arrogant laughter, and the sight of him defiling my private sanctuary triggered a primal rage I hadn't felt since I was a young man brawling in the union halls. It would be so easy. I was old, yes, but I was built from concrete and rebar. Richard was soft, a man made of paper and bad credit. I could break him before he even realized I was in the room. But I stopped. I forced my breathing to slow, counting the beats of my heart until the red haze cleared from my vision. Violence is the tool of the desperate, and I was not desperate. I was hunting. A hunter does not charge into the clearing roaring at the prey. A hunter waits. A hunter watches. A hunter strikes only when the trap is inescapable. If I went in there now, I would just be a crazy old man assaulting his family. The police would come. Richard would press charges. They would use my anger as proof of the dementia they were already fabricating. They would win. I couldn't give them that satisfaction. I needed more than satisfaction. I needed ammunition. I needed cold, hard, irrefutable proof that would stand up in a court of law and bury them so deep they would never see the sun again. I released my grip on the doorframe and stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. I left Richard to his whiskey and his delusions of grandeur. He thought he had already won, and that arrogance was his greatest weakness. I turned and moved silently toward the service elevator banks heading for the basement levels. The executive suite was the face of the company, but the server room was its brain. I had overseen the installation of the server farm myself 10 years ago. I knew where every cable ran, where every backup drive was stored, and most importantly, I knew the physical override codes that bypassed the digital security. The server room was freezing, kept at a constant 60 degrees to protect the banks of humming machines. The noise was a steady rhythmic drone, the sound of millions of dollars of data flowing through the veins of my empire. I walked to the main terminal console. It was locked, requiring a biometric scan and a password. My access had likely been revoked along with my credit cards, but I wasn't worried. I reached behind the console tower and found the physical maintenance port. I pulled a small silver USB drive from the inside pocket of my tuxedo jacket. It contained a military-grade data extraction program, a little gift from a former security consultant I had helped out of a jam years ago. I plugged it in. The screen flickered, then turned black, then filled with lines of white code. The extraction began. It was bypassing the user logs and copying the raw financial data directly from the root directory. A progress bar appeared, moving agonizingly slow. 5%, 10%. While the machine worked, I turned my attention to the secondary monitor. This one controlled the internal security feed. I needed to know what else they had been doing while I was exiled to the lake house. I pulled up the archive footage from the executive floor cameras. I scrolled back to 3 days ago. The video timestamp showed it was 2 in the afternoon. The office was empty. Then the door opened. Brandon and Tiffany walked in. They weren't working. They were laughing, stumbling slightly, clearly intoxicated in the middle of the workday. I watched my stomach churning as Tiffany swept a stack of my files off the desk, sending papers flying everywhere. She hopped up onto the mahogany surface, the desk I had built with my own hands, and pulled Brandon toward her. I looked away, disgusted. They were treating the heart of my company like a cheap motel room. But the next clip was worse. It was from yesterday. New Year's Eve hours before I arrived at the party. They were back in the office. Tiffany was standing in front of the oil painting that hung behind my desk. It was a portrait of Martha, my late wife. I had commissioned it for our 40th anniversary. It captured her smile perfectly, that gentle, knowing look that used to calm my storms. In the video, Tiffany was holding a letter opener. She said something to Brandon, pointing at the painting. Brandon hesitated, looking nervous. Tiffany sneered at him, said something else, and then she slashed the canvas. I gasped, the sound echoing in the empty room. She cut right through Martha's face. Then she grabbed the frame and ripped it off the wall. They threw it into the corner like garbage. Brandon didn't stop her. He didn't defend his mother's memory. He just watched, spineless and weak, as his wife destroyed the only woman who had ever loved him unconditionally. That was the moment the last ember of fatherly affection died in my chest. I stared at the screen, my eyes dry and burning. I wasn't sad. I was calcified. They weren't family anymore. They were targets. The beep of the main terminal pulled me back from the abyss. The download was complete. Extraction successful. I turned back to the main screen. I opened the folder labeled Investment Project X. This was the transaction Richard had been bragging about. I scanned the documents. It was structured as a capital expenditure for digital infrastructure expansion. On the surface, it looked like a legitimate, forward-thinking investment. But I knew how to read a ledger. I dug deeper, opening the subfiles for the recipient entity. The money, $5 million of liquid capital, was being sent to a company called Virtual Horizons Limited. The prospectus claimed they were building a luxury resort in the metaverse, a digital playground for the ultra-wealthy. It was filled with buzzwords and glossy renderings of non-existent buildings. But I scrolled down to the registration data. Virtual Horizons Limited wasn't a tech startup in Silicon Valley. It was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands 3 weeks ago. The registered agent was a law firm known for hiding assets. But the extraction software had pulled the metadata from the creation files. The original author of the incorporation documents wasn't a lawyer. It was Richard Miller. I stared at the name glowing on the screen. It wasn't just a bad investment. It was embezzlement. It was wire fraud. Richard had created a fake company to siphon $5 million out of my business, and he was using my son as the signatory to do it. Brandon was signing the checks, but Richard was cashing them. They were gutting the company, stealing the operating capital, and leaving a hollow shell behind. If this transfer went through on Monday, Caldwell and Sons wouldn't just be broke, it would be insolvent. We wouldn't be able to make payroll. The vendors wouldn't get paid. 30 years of work would evaporate in a single wire transfer. And they were going to frame me for it. That was the other part of the plan Richard had mentioned. The competency hearing. They would claim I authorized the bad investment in a fit of dementia, or that I was too senile to stop it. They would use the loss to justify taking control while Richard sat on a beach counting my money. I opened another folder titled Correspondence. It contained thousands of emails and instant messages between the three of them. I knew I should stop. I had the financial gun. I didn't need the emotional bullet. But I couldn't help myself. I clicked on a thread from 2 months ago with the subject line, "The Dinosaur." It was a conversation between Tiffany and Richard. They weren't just discussing business. They were dissecting my existence. Tiffany complained that I smelled like old oil and sawdust, a scent I wore with pride because it meant I had been working. She mocked the way I held my fork. She ridiculed the stories I told at dinner, the same stories Brandon used to beg to hear when he was a boy. I scrolled down and saw Brandon's name. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hoped foolishly that he had defended me, that he had told them to stop. But there it was in black and white. Brandon had replied with a laughing emoji. He wrote that he wished I would just hurry up and kick the bucket so he wouldn't have to listen to another lecture about the value of $1. He called me a relic. He said, I was an anchor dragging him down. I read on, forcing my eyes to take in every word. They discussed what they would do with my personal belongings once I was committed. They weren't going to put them in storage. They were going to burn them. My vintage tool collection, hand-forged hammers and wrenches that had built half this city, were slated for the scrap heap. Tiffany wanted the garage cleared out to make room for a home gym. She called my life's work junk. Then I found the brochure. It was a digital PDF attached to an email from Dr. Van Houten. It was for a facility called Shady Pines. I knew the place. It was a state-subsidized warehouse for the forgotten elderly on the far side of the county. It wasn't a luxury retirement community. It was a place that smelled of urine and boiled cabbage where they sedated the residents to keep them quiet. That was their plan for me. They weren't going to put me in a private suite. They were going to dump me in the cheapest hole they could find so they could keep more of the money for themselves. They had priced out my dignity and decided it wasn't worth the cost of a premium room. I sat there in the freezing darkness of the server room, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, and I felt a profound shift in my soul. The sadness evaporated. The grief for the son I thought I had vanished. In its place, a cold, hard resolve crystallized. I realized that the boy I raised was dead. The man upstairs, the one drinking my whiskey and laughing at my expense, was a stranger who viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle to his comfort. A parasite doesn't love the host. It only loves the blood. And I was done bleeding. I looked at my hands, the hands that had held Brandon when he was a baby, the hands that had built a legacy to ensure he would never know hunger. They were trembling not from fear, but from the sheer force of the revelation. They had dehumanized me to make their theft easier. They had convinced themselves I was already gone so they wouldn't have to feel guilty about burying me. I closed the email folder. I didn't need to see anymore. I had seen the bottom of the abyss. I ejected the drive, the physical weight of it now matching the emotional weight in my heart. I wasn't just fighting for my company anymore. I was fighting for my life. If I failed, if I let them win, that brochure would become my reality. I would die alone in a medicated fog while they toasted my demise. That fear, sharp and terrified, turned into fuel. I stood up, my knees cracking in the cold. I wasn't a relic. I was the architect of their destruction. And as I turned to leave, I made a silent vow to the ghost of the father I used to be. I would save the company. I would save the legacy. But I could not save my son. He had already chosen his path, and it led straight off a cliff. I was just going to give him the push he was begging for. This wasn't just data. It was a smoking gun. It was the key to their prison cells. Suddenly, I heard a noise from the hallway outside the server room. The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on concrete. A flashlight beam swept across the frosted glass of the door. The new security guard. He was doing his rounds. I froze. If he found me here now with the unauthorized login on the screen, everything would fall apart. He would call Brandon. They would know I was onto them. They would accelerate the transfer or destroy the evidence. I couldn't be seen. I looked around the room. There was no other exit. The footsteps got closer. The handle of the door jiggled. Locked. I heard the guard sigh and the beep of a keycard being pressed against the scanner. The light on the lock turned green. The mechanism whirred. I dropped to the floor and rolled under the main server rack, squeezing my body into the narrow space between the raised floor and the metal casing. It was tight, dusty, and uncomfortable. I held my breath. The door opened. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping over the consoles. The guard walked in. I could see his boots, heavy black combat style, just inches from my face. He walked to the terminal I had just used. He paused. I prayed I had wiped the screen properly. He hummed a tune, tapping his flashlight against his leg. He wasn't looking for intruders. He was just killing time. He turned and walked down the rows of servers, checking the temperature gauges. As soon as his back was turned, I crawled out from under the rack. I moved like a ghost, silent and fast. I reached the door he had left slightly ajar. I slipped through it, closing it softly behind me just as he turned around at the far end of the room. I didn't wait to hear the lock click. I moved swiftly down the hall, taking the stairs down to the loading dock instead of the elevator. I pushed through the maintenance door and stepped out into the biting cold of the alley. The snow was falling again, covering my tracks. I walked back to my truck, the cold air filling my lungs, but I didn't feel the chill. I felt the heat of the drive in my pocket. I had the evidence. Now I needed a weapon. I started the engine and pulled away, leaving the building silent and dark behind me. They thought they were safe. They thought the old man was finished. But they had just handed me the shovel, and I was about to dig their graves. I drove south, leaving the pristine snow of the industrial park behind, and entering the gray slush of the city's older suburbs. The houses here were small, sitting close together, like teeth in a crooked jaw, with peeling paint and chain-link fences. It was a far cry from the lakefront, but this was where honesty lived now. I pulled my truck up to a modest bungalow with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side. This was the home of Harper Evans. 6 months ago, Harper had been the general counsel for Caldwell & Sons. She was the best lawyer I had ever known, a woman who could spot a loophole from a mile away, and who defended my company with the ferocity of a lioness. She was 55 years old, sharp professional, and fiercely loyal to the legacy I built. And that was exactly why Brandon fired her. He called me the day he did it, spouting nonsense about corporate restructuring and needing a fresh perspective. He said Harper didn't fit the new company culture. What he meant was that Harper wouldn't let him buy a Ferrari with the company credit card. She was the last guardrail keeping my son on the road, and he had removed her so he could drive off the cliff. I walked up the icy path and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately. Harper stood there, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, holding a mug of tea. She didn't look surprised to see me standing there in a tuxedo jacket on New Year's Day. She didn't ask why I wasn't at the lake house or why I looked like I hadn't slept in 24 hours. She just looked at my eyes, then stepped back to let me in. "Hello, Harry," she said, her voice raspy from the dry winter air. "I had a feeling you would be coming by sooner or later. Coffee is in the pot. Help yourself." The inside of her house was like her mind, organized, practical, and filled with books. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, my hands finally stopping their subtle trembling. I sat down at her small kitchen table. Harper sat opposite me. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered focus. "I know about the Metaverse project," I said, getting straight to the point. "I know about Richard. I know about the $5 million. Harper nodded, taking a sip of her tea. "I assumed you would figure it out eventually," she said. "But that is just the tip of the iceberg, Harry. The money is just theft. What they are planning for you is much worse than bankruptcy." She stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a thick gray accordion folder. She placed it on the table between us. The label on the front was handwritten in red ink. Project Brittany. I stared at it. "What is this?" I asked. Harper opened the folder. Inside were medical documents, legal petitions, and transcripts of emails. "This is why Brandon fired me," she said. "I found this on the printer in the executive suite 6 months ago. I made a copy before they escorted me out of the building. I picked up the first document. It was a draft for a petition of conservatorship. It was a legal request to strip me of all my rights. My right to manage my money. My right to make medical decisions. Even my right to decide where I lived. It was the same legal cage they had used to trap pop stars and senile billionaires. "Read the medical evaluation," Harper said, pointing to a stapled packet. I flipped the page. It was a psychiatric evaluation dated 2 weeks ago. It was signed by a Dr. Arthur Van Houten. I had never met a Dr. Van Houten in my life. The report detailed a series of examinations that never happened. It claimed I suffered from advanced vascular dementia characterized by paranoid delusions, violent outbursts, and an inability to recognize family members. It cited specific incidents that were complete fabrications. It said I had attacked a waiter at a restaurant. It said I had forgotten my own son's name. "This is a lie," I whispered, the paper shaking in my hand. "I have never met this doctor." Harper nodded grimly. I looked him up. Van Houten lost his license in Florida for prescription fraud. He is practicing here under a provisional reinstatement. He is Richard's golf buddy. Tiffany paid him $10,000 as a consulting fee last month. I have the invoice right there. I looked at the invoice. Consulting services. $10,000. They had bought a diagnosis. They were going to use this to lock me away in a facility while they spent my life's work. "That little scene last night," Harper said, her eyes sharp. "The soup, the outburst. They provoked you, Harry. They wanted a room full of witnesses to see you act irrationally. If Richard takes that story to a judge combined with this fake medical report, they will grant an emergency temporary conservatorship within 24 hours. They won't just take the $5 million. They will take everything. The land, the accounts. You." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. It was a perfect trap. If I fought back, I looked crazy. If I did nothing, I was helpless. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the USB drive. "I have the proof, Harper," I said, slamming the drive onto the table. "I have the server logs. I have the video of them destroying Martha's painting. I have the metadata showing Richard created the shell company. We have them. Call the police. Call the FBI. I want them arrested today." I started to stand up, ready to drive to the precinct, but Harper reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Sit down, Harry," she ordered. I looked at her, shocked by her tone. "What do you mean, sit down? We have the evidence." "No," Harper said, her voice steady and hard. "You have evidence of conspiracy. You have evidence of intent. But if you call the police right now, do you know what will happen? Brandon will claim he was duped by Richard. He will say he didn't know the metaverse company was a shell. He will play the incompetent son who made a bad investment. He will get a slap on the wrist. Richard will claim the incorporation documents were just a draft, and he never intended to defraud anyone. He will claim the $5 million hasn't been transferred yet, so no crime has actually been committed." "But the medical report," I argued. "Medical malpractice at best," Harper countered. "Hard to prove criminal intent without a recording. They will walk away, Harry. Richard will disappear. Brandon will stay in control of the company because you are still technically the retired father who signed it over. And they will try again. Next time they won't miss." I slumped back in my chair. "So what do we do? Do we just let them win?" "No," Harper said, a dangerous smile touching her lips. "We let them commit the crime. We don't stop the transfer. We let Brandon send that $5 million on Monday morning. Once that money hits the offshore account, it is no longer conspiracy. It is federal wire fraud. It is money laundering. It is a felony with a mandatory minimum sentence. But the money, I said, if they transfer it, it is gone. I can't lose $5 million, Harper. That is the operating capital for the entire year. The company will collapse. Harper leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the game. That is where you are wrong, Harry. You are looking at this like a businessman. You need to look at it like a lawyer. You retained the land right. You hold the hard assets. Yes, I said. And when you handed the CEO title to Brandon, did you sign the standard indemnity clauses protecting him from personal liability? I frowned, thinking back to the stack of papers. No, I didn't. I wanted him to be responsible. I wanted him to feel the weight of ownership. Exactly, Harper said. That is the key. Since Brandon is acting as the CEO, and since he is using company funds for a fraudulent transaction that benefits him personally through his wife's family, he is piercing the corporate veil. He is personally liable. And because you are the chairman of the board and the primary shareholder, you can execute a specific type of financial maneuver. She pulled a blank legal pad toward her and started drawing a diagram. We are going to let him send the money, she explained, but we are going to change the source. You have a secured lending agreement in your personal trust, don't you? A clause that allows you to lend money to the corporation in times of crisis secured by equity. I nodded slowly. Yes. The emergency liquidity provision. We are going to activate it, Harper said, but we are going to twist it. We are going to trick them into signing a document that they think is the medical power of attorney. But in reality, it will be a confirmation of a personal loan from you to Brandon, secured by his 49% stake in the company. I stared at her, the genius of it slowly sinking in. So when he sends the $5 million, I said, piecing it together, he won't be sending the company's money. Harper nodded. He will be sending your money, which you just loaned him personally. And when the FBI seizes it as proceeds of a crime, Brandon will be in default on the loan instantly. And I can foreclose on his stock, I whispered. You won't just send them to prison, Harry Harper said softly. You will strip them of every single thing they own. You will take back your company, your house, and your dignity. But to do this, you have to be brave. You have to let them think they have won. You have to let them think you are weak. You have to go to the hospital. The hospital, I asked. Yes, Harper said. We need to stage a medical emergency. We need to get them into a room with a notary and a stack of papers while they are panicked and greedy. We need them to sign their own death warrants thinking they are signing your commitment papers. Can you play the part of the dying old man one last time? I thought about the look on Tiffany's face when she dropped that badge in my soup. I thought about Richard's feet on my desk. I can play it, I said, a cold resolve settling over me. I will give the performance of a lifetime. Good, Harper said, standing up. Let me get my coat. We have a document to forge and an ambulance to call. The game is on Harry, and this time we are playing by my rules. The lobby of the Grand Hyatt was the perfect stage for my final performance. It was crowded enough to ensure witnesses, but impersonal enough that no one would look too closely at the details. I stood near the marble fountain checking my watch. It was 2 p.m. on New Year's Day. Harper had arranged everything. She had a contact in the ER admissions department, an old friend who owed her a favor, ensuring that when the ambulance arrived, I would be fast-tracked to a private room without too many questions about my actual vitals. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the indignity of what I was about to do. I was a man who had built skyscrapers, who had walked steel beams 500 feet in the air, without flinching, and now I had to throw myself on the floor like a soccer player faking an injury. But pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. I let my knees buckle. I let my cane clatter loudly against the marble tile. I grabbed my chest, let out a ragged gasp that turned heads 3 tables away and collapsed. The impact with the floor was harder than I expected, jarring my hip, but I stayed down. I heard screams. I felt hands on my shoulders. Someone was calling 911. I kept my eyes half closed, acting disoriented, mumbling about my heart. By the time the paramedics loaded me onto the stretcher, I was fully committed to the role of the frail, dying patriarch. In the ambulance, I pulled out my phone, my hand deliberately shaking. I typed a text to Brandon. "Dad is in the hospital. Chest pains. I feel very tired. Come quickly." I hit send and dropped the phone onto the stretcher sheet. The hook was baited. Now I just had to wait for the sharks to smell the blood. I was settled into a private room in the cardiac wing within 20 minutes. Harper had done her work well. The nurse on duty, a woman named Sarah who was in on the plan, hooked me up to a monitor that was running a simulation loop. It showed an erratic, weak heartbeat. I lay back against the pillows, messing up my hair, letting my mouth hang slightly open. I looked like death warmed over. I waited. It didn't take long. Less than 30 minutes after my text, the door to my room banged open. Brandon and Tiffany rushed in. They were breathless, their faces flushed, but I knew my son well enough to read the signs. That wasn't the flush of concern. It was the flush of adrenaline. They weren't running because they were afraid I would die. They were running because they were afraid I would die before I signed the papers. Tiffany was wearing a fur coat over her yoga clothes, looking like she had sprinted directly from a brunch. She rushed to the bedside, grabbing my hand with a grip that was painfully tight. "Oh, Daddy," she wailed, her voice shrill and loud enough for the hallway to hear. We were so worried. We came as fast as we could. I looked at her, letting my eyes drift out of focus. "Tiffany," I rasped. "Is that you?" "Yes, it is me, Dad," she said, squeezing my hand harder. "Brandon is here too. We are all here." Brandon stood at the foot of the bed. He looked pale, sweating. He couldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the heart monitor, watching the fake, erratic line. I could see the guilt warring with the greed in his eyes, but the greed was winning. He was weak. He had always been weak. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "The doctors say, they say you need to rest. They say it is serious." I nodded slowly. "I know, son. I feel heavy." Tiffany didn't waste another second. She reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a thick blue folder. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't ask if I needed water. She went straight for the kill. "Dad, listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though the urgency remained. "Because you are not well, the doctors are worried about making medical decisions if you go unconscious. We need to be able to help you. We need to be able to tell them to save you." She opened the folder on the bedside table. I saw the top document. It was a standard medical power of attorney form. It authorized Brandon to make health decisions for me. But I saw the thickness of the stack. I saw the way she held the corner of the papers down. Underneath the medical form was a much denser document. The general durable power of attorney. The financial keys to the kingdom. And below that, the conservatorship consent form. "We just need you to sign these, Dad," Brandon said, stepping closer. "Just so we can take care of you, so we can handle the insurance and the bills while you get better." I looked at my son. He was lying to a dying man. He was trying to trick his father into signing away his freedom on what he thought was his deathbed. The betrayal was absolute. It was a cold, physical pain in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart. I don't know," I whispered, feigning confusion. "My glasses. I can't read it." "You don't need to read it, Dad," Tiffany said, shoving a pen into my hand. "It is just standard hospital forms, just the medical stuff. Trust us. We are family." Family. The word tasted like ash. I let my hand tremble. I let the pen hover over the paper. I looked at the door. It was time. "Excuse me," a sharp voice cut through the tension. Tiffany spun around. A nurse had entered the room. She was wearing a mask, a surgical cap, and oversized scrubs that hid her figure. She was holding a clipboard and a tray of medications. It was Harper. Even with half her face covered, I recognized the steel in her eyes. "I need to administer his medication," Harper said, her voice disguised by a thick, fake accent. "And visiting hours are restricted for cardiac patients. 2 minutes only." Tiffany growled in frustration. "We are leaving," she snapped. "He just needs to sign this urgent medical release." Harper walked over to the other side of the bed. "I need to witness any signature for the hospital records," she said efficiently. "It is protocol." She reached out and took the folder from Tiffany's hand. Tiffany resisted for a split second, but Harper was authoritative, playing the role of the overworked, no-nonsense nurse perfectly. "Let me adjust the table," Harper said. She turned her back to them for a fraction of a second, blocking their view with her body as she set the folder down on the rolling tray. In that blink of an eye, her hands moved with the speed of a magician. She slid the bottom documents, the financial power of attorney, and the conservatorship papers into the hidden pocket of her scrubs. Simultaneously, she pulled a single sheet of paper from the bottom of her own clipboard and slid it under the medical power of attorney cover sheet. It was done. The switch was made. She turned back to me, smoothing the top paper. "Sign here, sir," she said, tapping the line. I looked at the paper. The top sheet was still the medical form Tiffany wanted, but I could see the edge of the paper underneath. It wasn't the conservatorship. It was the document Harper and I had drafted the night before. The secured personal loan agreement. By signing it, I wasn't giving them control. I was executing a personal loan of $5 million to Brandon, collateralized by his entire stake in the company. I took a deep breath. I looked at Brandon one last time. "I gave him a chance, son," I said. "Are you sure about this?" Brandon looked at Tiffany. She glared at him, her eyes manic. "Yes, Dad," Brandon said. "Just sign it, please." I lowered the pen. I let my hand shake violently, scrawling a jagged, barely legible signature on the line. I pressed down hard, making sure the carbon copy underneath captured the ink. "There," I whispered, dropping the pen. Tiffany snatched the papers off the table before the ink was even dry. She didn't check the second page. She didn't check anything. She was too blinded by victory. She stuffed the papers back into her bag, a triumphant, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Good," she said. "That is good, Dad. Now you just rest. We will handle everything." She grabbed Brandon's arm. "Come on, we need to get these to the lawyer before the bank opens on Monday." Brandon looked back at me, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but Tiffany pulled him toward the door. "Bye, Dad," he mumbled. "Get better." They walked out of the room without looking back. They walked out thinking they owned me. They walked out thinking they had just stolen $5 million and my freedom. They didn't know they had just signed a confession and a bankruptcy filing in the same stroke. The door clicked shut. The room went silent. Harper reached up and pulled off her surgical mask. She let out a long breath and looked at me. "They didn't even look," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "They were so hungry, they didn't even look at what they were eating." I sat up, ripping the sensors off my chest. The beeping stopped. I felt a surge of energy, the cold, hard energy of the endgame. "They looked," I said, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "They just saw what they wanted to see." Harper reached into her pocket and pulled out the papers she had stolen from Tiffany's folder. She held them up. "We have the conservatorship draft," she said, "and we have the loan agreement signed and witnessed. The trap is set, Harry. Now we just have to wait for them to snap it shut." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered parking lot. I saw Brandon's Range Rover peeling out of the lot, speeding toward the exit. They were rushing to their celebration. They were rushing to the bank. "Let them run," I said. "They are just running to the end of the leash. And on Monday morning, I am going to yank it." I turned back to Harper. "Get my clothes," I said. "I have a party to crash." The moment the elevator doors hissed shut at the end of the hallway, I sat up in the hospital bed and ripped the oxygen cannula from my nose. The plastic tubing clattered against the plastic rail of the bed, a sound that marked the end of the theater and the beginning of the execution. I took a deep breath of the sterile hospital air filling my lungs, without the feigned rattle of a dying man. I felt strong. I felt dangerous. Harper was already moving, her demeanor shifting instantly from the subservient nurse to the shark-like attorney she truly was. She walked to the window, checked the blinds, and then turned back to me, holding up the single sheet of paper that Tiffany had been so desperate to secure. "You have a very distinct signature, Harry," she said, a dry smile playing on her lips as she inspected the jagged scrawl I had left on the line. "Even when you are pretending to be on your deathbed, you press down hard." I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and reached for my clothes. "Is it legally binding?" I asked. Harper snapped the paper with her finger. "It is ironclad." They didn't even look at the header. They were so focused on the idea of the conservatorship that they didn't realize they were signing a secured promissory note. She handed me the document so I could see it with my own eyes. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering. In simple terms, it stated that I, Harrison Caldwell, was lending my son Brandon Caldwell the sum of $5 million for the express purpose of a private investment. The terms were immediate. The interest rate was standard. But the collateral clause was where the trap lay. To secure this loan, Brandon had pledged 100% of his equity in Caldwell and Sons, his 49% stake, his entire future. By signing this, Harper explained, her eyes gleaming, Brandon has just acknowledged that the $5 million he is about to transfer on Monday morning is not corporate blood money he is stealing. It is a personal debt he is taking on. He thinks he is robbing the company vault using your authority. In reality, he is borrowing your money to hand it to a con artist. And the moment that money leaves the secure escrow account, he is in default. I buttoned my shirt, feeling the familiar weight of the fabric against my skin. "So when he sends the money to Richard," I said, fastening my cuffs, "he is essentially buying a one-way ticket to the poorhouse." "Exactly," Harper said. "He sends the cash, Richard steals it, and Brandon is left owing you $5 million he doesn't have. And since he can't pay you back, you exercise the lien. You take his stock, you take his position, you take everything." I put on my jacket and checked my reflection in the darkened window. I didn't see a victim. I saw the CEO who was about to hostile take over his own family. "Let's get out of here," I said. "I want to be watching the monitors when he pulls the trigger." The Sunday between the hospital charade and the Monday morning execution was the longest day of my life. I spent it sitting at Harper's kitchen table watching the remote surveillance feeds like a hawk circling its prey. It was fascinating and horrifying to watch them in their natural habitat when they thought the predator was dead. We had access to everything linked to the company accounts, including the GPS data on the corporate vehicles. I watched the digital dot representing Brandon's phone move to a luxury car dealership. He spent 3 hours test driving a Lamborghini, revving the engine, bragging to the salesman about a massive liquidity event that was happening the next day. He was mentally spending money he had technically already lost. Tiffany was even worse. She spent the entire day online, her browsing history, logging thousands of dollars in virtual shopping carts, filled with Italian furniture and marble statues, planning a remodel for a home she was about to be evicted from. It was a macabre parade of gluttony. Harper asked me if I felt bad watching them walk off the cliff. I told her no. You don't feel bad when a termite bites into poisoned wood. You just feel relief that the structure might still be saved, I I drank my coffee black and waited for the sun to rise on their judgment day. Monday morning arrived with a gray slate sky that promised more snow, but inside the executive suite of Caldwell & Sons the mood was sunny with the prospect of theft. I wasn't there physically, of course. I was sitting in Harper's home office surrounded by monitors watching the digital ghost of my company operate in real time. We had tapped into the internal network through the back door I had opened in the server room. I could see the keystrokes. I could see the login activity. I could even hear the audio from the conference room bug Harper had planted months ago, a little insurance policy she had never mentioned until now. At 9 o'clock sharp, Brandon logged into the CEO terminal. I could hear his breathing over the audio feed. It was shallow, rapid. He was nervous. He knew he was crossing a line, but he had his wife whispering poison in one ear and his father-in-law shouting demands in the other. "Do it, Brandon." Richard's voice came through the speakers loud and distorted by the speakerphone. "The bank is open. The window is now. Stop hesitating." "I am just checking the authorization codes," Brandon stammered. If the lawyers see this." "Your dad is a vegetable." Tiffany's voice cut in sharp and impatient. "We have the medical power of attorney. We have the control. You are the CEO, Brandon. Act like it. Send the money." I watched the screen in Harper's office. I saw Brandon's mouse cursor hover over the transfer button. The banking interface was open. The destination account was entered Virtual Horizons Limited, Cayman Islands. The amount $5 million. "He thinks he is using the corporate reserve account," Harper whispered, leaning in close to the screen. "He thinks he is draining the operating capital." But he wasn't. Because at 8:01 that morning, George in Zurich had processed the document Harper faxed over. The banking system had rerouted the source of funds. The corporate reserve was locked down tight. The system had quietly, invisibly switched the active withdrawal line to the personal lending facility, a special account funded by my own private assets, specifically designed for this moment. Brandon clicked the mouse. I held my breath. Across town, in a glass tower, my son committed financial suicide. The screen on our monitor refreshed. Processing. I could imagine the silence in that office. The three of them, Brandon, Tiffany, Richard, huddled around the glow of the monitor, holding their breath, just like I was praying for the green light that would make them rich. Approved. The text flashed on the screen. Transfer complete. Transaction ID 998 Alpha Zulu. I heard the cheer erupt through the speakers. Richard shouted something about champagne. Tiffany laughed that high, tinkling sound of breaking glass. Brandon let out a long, audible exhale, a sound of relief that was heartbreaking in its ignorance. "They did it," Harper said, sitting back in her chair. "They actually did it." I stared at the screen. The money was gone. $5 million of my hard-earned cash was now sitting in a shell company controlled by a thief. But I didn't feel the loss. I felt the cold satisfaction of the trap snapping shut. "Brandon thinks he just embezzled company funds," I said quietly. "He thinks he is a criminal mastermind." "He is not a criminal mastermind," Harper corrected. "He is just a broke man with a lot of debt." "Look at the transaction log." She pointed to the secondary window on her screen. A notification had just popped up from the bank's internal messaging system. It was the automated confirmation of the loan execution. Loan agreement activated. Principal amount $5,000, $1,000. Borrower Brandon Caldwell. Collateral $49,000 was Class A shares. Status dispersed. And then a second notification appeared blinking in angry red letters. Alert collateral verification failed. Borrower liquidity below threshold. Default imminent. The system worked fast. The moment the money left the account, the bank's algorithm checked Brandon's personal solvency. Since he had just sent the cash to the Caymans, he had zero liquidity to service the loan. He was technically in default 3 seconds after he clicked send. Richard is celebrating, I said, listening to the clinking of glasses over the audio feed. Let them celebrate, Harper said. They have about 24 hours before the hangover hits. Richard thinks he just stole your company's money. He doesn't know he just stole Brandon's inheritance. And Brandon doesn't know he just handed you the deed to his life. I stood up and walked to the window looking out at the snow-covered street. The neighbors were digging out their cars, going to work, living their honest lives. My son was popping corks thinking he had won the lottery. He never read the papers, I murmured. He never reads the papers. He trusted the wrong people, Harper said, just like you did when you gave him the CEO title. I turned back to her. The difference is I fixed my mistake. Harper closed the laptop. The trap is sprung, Harry. Now we just need to collect the carcass. The FBI has the transaction number. They are tracking the wire to the Caymans as we speak. Because the money came from a personal loan structure, Richard's receipt of it constitutes wire fraud against an individual you. It is cleaner. It is personal. And because Brandon facilitated it, he is an accessory. But I am not sending Brandon to jail, I said firmly. No, Harper agreed. You are doing something worse. You are evicting him. You are taking his company. You are leaving him with nothing but his wife and his father-in-law. That is a prison sentence all its own. I picked up my coat. It was time for the final act. They were having a party to celebrate their victory. It would be rude of me not to attend. Are you ready for the grand finale? Harper asked. I adjusted my collar. I have never been more ready in my life. Let's go crash a party. The drive back up to Lake Tahoe was smooth, the plow trucks having cleared the roads of the weekend's snow, leaving the asphalt black and glistening under the winter sun. I sat in the back of a black Suburban, this time not my pickup truck. Beside me sat Harper, reviewing a stack of files with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Behind us, in two unmarked sedans, rode 4 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crimes Division. They were quiet, serious men who had found the evidence on the USB drive very compelling. We pulled up to the gate of my estate just as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. I punched in the code. The gate swung open. It seemed my family had been too busy popping corks to change the security settings. I could see the house glowing from 100 yards away. Every light was on. It looked like a cruise ship in the middle of the forest. They weren't just celebrating. They were broadcasting their victory to the world. I told the driver to kill the headlights. We rolled up the driveway in stealth, the tires crunching softly on the packed snow. Through the massive bay windows of the living room, I could see them. It was a tableau of pure, unadulterated greed. Richard was standing by the fireplace, holding a bottle of champagne like a trophy. Linda was laughing, her head thrown back, clapping her hands. Tiffany was dancing, twirling in a new dress that probably cost more than my first house. And Brandon, my son, was slumped on the sofa, a glass in his hand, looking like a man who had just survived a firing squad and was drinking to forget the sound of the guns. They were celebrating the death of my legacy. They were toasting to the $5 million they thought was sitting safely in a Cayman Islands account. They were laughing at the memory of the old man they believed was lying helpless in a hospital bed, drooling and confused, waiting for the state to lock him away. They had no idea the old man was standing outside their door, adjusting his cufflinks. I checked my reflection in the darkened window of the SUV. I wasn't wearing the hospital gown anymore. I wasn't wearing the wrinkled tuxedo from New Year's Eve. I was wearing a charcoal gray bespoke suit, cut from Italian wool, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that shimmered like steel. My shoes were polished to a mirror shine. I stood tall, my shoulders squared the cane left behind in the car. I didn't need a crutch today. I needed presence. Ready? Harper asked, stepping out beside me. I looked at the house one last time. I felt a strange sense of detachment. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is hot. This was cold. This was demolition. Let's go, I said. I walked to the front door. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I used my key. The heavy oak door swung open silently on its well-oiled hinges. The sound of music and laughter spilled out into the cold air. We stepped into the foyer, the FBI agents fanning out behind me, silent shadows moving into position. We walked toward the living room. The thick Persian rugs absorbed our footsteps. We were ghosts invading their feast. I stopped in the archway just out of the direct line of sight and listened. To Brandon, Richard bellowed, raising his glass. To the man who finally had the guts to pull the trigger. And to the metaverse. May it make us all billionaires. To the metaverse, Tiffany cheered, clinking her glass against his. And to Harrison, may he enjoy the pudding at the nursing home. They all laughed. It was a cruel, sharp sound. Even Brandon chuckled, a weak, pathetic sound of capitulation. That is enough, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. The laughter died instantly. The music seemed to stop on its own. 4 heads whipped around toward the archway. I stepped into the light. The reaction was visceral. Linda dropped her glass. It shattered on the hardwood champagne foaming over her shoes. Richard choked on his drink, coughing violently. Brandon turned white, his eyes bulging as if he were seeing a dead man walking. Tiffany just stared, her mouth hanging open, her brain unable to process the image in front of her. They were expecting an invalid. They were expecting a confused geriatric patient. Instead, they got Harrison Caldwell, the man who built half the skyline of the city. I stood there radiating power and control, looking at them with the cold assessment of a judge staring down the condemned. Dad Brandon stammered, scrambling to stand up, knocking over a vase in the process. You are supposed to be... The doctors said what Brandon I asked, stepping further into the room. That I was senile. That I was weak. That I was ready to be put out to pasture. Who let you in here? Tiffany screamed, her shock turning instantly to aggression. She marched toward me, her face twisting into a mask of fury. You are not well. You are confused. You need to go back to the hospital right now. She pointed a manicured finger at my face. Get out. Get out before I call the orderlies. You are delusional, old man. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at her finger, then at her face. Behind me, Harper stepped into view holding a black leather briefcase. Behind her, 4 men in windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across the back stepped into the room. The air left the room. Richard froze mid-cough. Brandon sank back onto the sofa. Tiffany stopped dead in her tracks, her hand falling to her side. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit. Tiffany flinched, perhaps thinking I was reaching for a weapon. In a way, I was. I pulled out the cheap plastic lanyard she had put around my neck 3 nights ago. The soup stain had been wiped off, but the word "Observer" was still printed in bold black letters. I looked at it for a moment, remembering how heavy it had felt that night. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I tossed it onto the coffee table right next to the bottle of champagne. It landed with a soft clack sliding across the polished wood. You wanted me to watch, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You wanted me to sit in the corner and observe while you carved up my life. You thought I was just a spectator in my own home. I looked at Richard, who was now backing away toward the patio doors. I looked at Brandon, who was burying his face in his hands. I looked at Tiffany, who was trembling, her eyes darting between me and the federal agents. Well, here I am, I said. I am observing, but I didn't come to watch you eat my food. I came to watch you go to prison. Agents, I said, stepping aside. They are all yours. The room fell into a stunned silence as Harper Evans stepped forward, the heels of her boots clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She held a single sheet of paper in her hand. Not a toast, not a greeting, but a federal warrant. She looked at Richard, who was still frozen mid-step toward the patio door, and Linda, who was clutching her pearl necklace as if it were a rosary. Harper's voice was calm, projecting with the authority of a judge reading a death sentence. Richard Miller and Linda Miller, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, federal money laundering, and operating an unlicensed securities exchange. The agents moved in a synchronized wave, closing off the exits. Richard tried to stammer a defense, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is absurd!" he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That is a legitimate development project. We have investors. We have blueprints." Harper didn't even blink. Virtual Horizons Limited has been a flagged entity on the FBI cybercrimes watch list for 24 months, she said, her tone cutting through his bluster like a scalpel. "You didn't invent a metaverse resort, Richard. You bought a template from a dark web forum that has been used to defraud investors in 3 different states. We have the server logs linking your IP address to the creation of the shell accounts. We have the chat logs where you discussed structuring the deposits to avoid IRS detection. You aren't a developer. You are a digital pickpocket, and today you reached into the wrong wallet." Linda let out a high-pitched scream as an agent took her arm, pulling her hands behind her back. "Richard, you said it was safe," she shrieked, turning on her husband instantly. "You said the old man was senile. You said nobody was watching." The handcuffs ratcheted shut with a metallic finality that echoed through the large room. Richard was pinned against the wall, his face pressed into the expensive wallpaper he had probably picked out himself. Brandon stood in the center of the chaos, turning in circles, his eyes wide and unseeing. He looked from his father-in-law in handcuffs to me standing there in my bespoke suit. The denial in his brain was fighting a losing war against reality. "Wait," he stammered, holding up his hands as if to stop a train. "Dad, stop this. This is a mistake. I authorized that transfer. I am the CEO. I have the authority to make high-risk capital deployments. It is a corporate investment. Even if it went bad, it is just a loss. It is not a crime. I signed the order. It is legal." He was clinging to his title like a drowning man clings to driftwood. He thought that being the boss protected him. He thought that because he sat in the big chair, his mistakes were just tax write-offs. Harper turned her gaze toward him. It wasn't angry. It was almost pitying, the way a vet looks at an animal that needs to be put down. "No, Brandon," she said softly. "You didn't authorize a corporate investment. You executed a personal wire transfer." Brandon frowned. Confusion scrunching his face, making him look like a little boy again. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I used the executive terminal. I sent it from the reserve account." "You sent it from the personal lending facility," Harper corrected, pulling a copy of the document from her briefcase. "Remember the papers you signed in the hospital, Brandon? The ones you were too busy to read because you were rushing to get to this party to drink champagne. You didn't sign a medical power of attorney. You signed a secured promissory note." She held the paper up so he could see his own signature, jagged and hasty at the bottom. "You borrowed $5 million from your father's personal estate," she explained. "You, Brandon Caldwell, the individual, not the company. And the moment you sent that borrowed money to a known fraudulent entity, you triggered the immediate default clause in the agreement. You owe your father $5 million payable immediately. Do you have $5 million in your checking account, Brandon?" Brandon's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. I borrowed. But the collateral." "Yes, the collateral," I said, stepping forward, my voice low and heavy. Harper read him paragraph 4. Harper adjusted her glasses. "To secure this loan, the borrower pledges 100% of his equity holdings in Caldwell and Sons Construction, 49% of the Class A stock." I walked up to my son. I looked him in the eye. "You defaulted, son," I said, and since you can't pay me back in cash, I am exercising my right to the collateral. I seized the stock 5 minutes ago. You don't own 49% of my company anymore. You don't own a single share. You aren't the CEO. You are just a man who borrowed money to give to a thief, and now you are bankrupt. The reality hit him like a physical blow. His knees actually buckled and he slumped onto the white carpet, the same carpet he had watched his wife destroy my painting on. He looked at his hands. He realized he was destitute. No company, no salary, no power, no future. He had walked into this room a multimillionaire. He was now sitting on the floor with a net worth of 0. He looked up, frantic, searching for a lifeline. His eyes landed on Tiffany. She was standing near the window watching the scene unfold with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. But it wasn't horror for her husband. It wasn't horror for her parents being dragged out the door. It was horror for herself. She was doing the math. No stock meant no dividends. No dividends meant no black card. No black card meant she was just a woman in a dress she couldn't afford. Tiffany Brandon pleaded, reaching a hand out toward her. Tell them we did this for us. Tell them we can fix this. Tiffany looked at his outstretched hand like it was covered in filth. Her face, usually so composed and perfectly made up, twisted into a sneer of absolute contempt. The mask of the loving, supportive wife didn't just slip. It shattered into a million pieces. She hissed, her voice dripping with venom. There is no we, you idiot. You lost it. You lost the company. I didn't know, Brandon stammered, tears streaming down his face. They tricked me. You let them trick you, Tiffany screamed, her voice cracking. You had one job, Brandon, one job. Wait for the old man to die and cash the checks. And you couldn't even do that. You signed it away. You signed our life away in a hospital room because you couldn't be bothered to read. She laughed, a harsh barking sound that was ugly and terrified. My father was right about you. You are spineless. You are a loser, Brandon. A broke, pathetic loser. Brandon recoiled as if she had slapped him. Tiffany, please, he sobbed. I am your husband. You are a bad investment, she spat back, turning away from him. And I am cutting my losses. She looked at me, then at the FBI agents, her eyes wild. I had nothing to do with this. I didn't sign anything. I am a victim here. This was all him. I watched my son's heart break in real time. It wasn't the loss of the money that destroyed him in that moment. It was seeing the woman he had sacrificed his integrity for, the woman that he had chosen over his own father. Discard him the moment his utility ran out. He looked at me, a look of utter devastation in his eyes. He finally understood. He had burned down his fortress to keep her warm, and she was complaining about the smoke. She doesn't love you, son, I said quietly. She never did. She loved the view from the summit. Now that you are in the valley, you are on your own. Tiffany turned her back on her weeping husband, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape route. The FBI agents were escorting her parents toward the front door, the heavy tread of their boots echoing the finality of the situation. Her parents were gone. Her husband was bankrupt. Her status was incinerated. But as her gaze landed on the expensive furniture, the crystal chandelier, and the snow falling softly outside the panoramic windows, a new kind of desperation took hold of her. She realized she had nowhere to go. She had no money for a hotel. Her credit cards were frozen. She was trapped in the middle of a blizzard with nothing but the clothes on her back. She spun around to face me, her chin jutting out in a final defiant stand. She planted her feet firmly on the Persian rug, crossing her arms over her chest. You think you have won? She spat, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. You think you can just snap your fingers and make us disappear? Well, you forgot one thing, old man. You forgot the law. She pointed a finger at the floor. This is our primary residence. We have lived here for 3 years. We receive our mail here. We have established residency. Under state law, you cannot just throw us out into the snow. You have to give us 30 days' notice. You have to go through the courts. You have to file for eviction." She took a step forward, her confidence surging back as she clung to the technicality. "That is right. I know my rights. We are tenants. We have a lease. Even if you terminated it on New Year's Eve, the law protects us. So get out of my house. Get out, or I will call the sheriff and have you arrested for harassment. You have 30 days, Harrison, and in 30 days I will strip this house of everything that isn't bolted down. I will sell the copper out of the walls if I have to. You won't get a house back. You will get a shell." Brandon looked up from the floor, wiping his nose, a flicker of hope igniting in his dull eyes. "She is right, Dad," he mumbled, his voice weak. "We have rights. You can't just kick us out tonight. It is illegal." I looked at them. They were clinging to the tenancy laws like a shield, thinking the bureaucracy of the state would protect them from the consequences of their actions. They thought they had found a loophole that would buy them a month of warmth and a chance to steal whatever assets were left in the house. I didn't get angry. I didn't argue. I simply looked at Harper. She was standing by the fireplace watching Tiffany's tantrum with a look of mild amusement. I gave her a small nod. Harper walked over to the coffee table, right where I had thrown the observer badge. She placed her briefcase down and clicked the latches open. The sound was loud in the quiet room. She pulled out a large rolled-up document. It wasn't a standard legal brief. It was a blueprint yellowed with age, smelling faintly of old paper and ammonia. "You are absolutely correct, Mrs. Caldwell," Harper said, her voice calm and professional. "Tenant laws are very strict in this state. If this were a residential property, and if you were residential tenants, we would indeed have to provide you with a 30-day notice to vacate. We would have to file a writ of possession. It would be a long, drawn-out process." Tiffany smirked, thinking she had won a temporary reprieve. "Exactly," she sneered. "So take your agents and get out." But Harper continued unrolling the blueprint on the coffee table, smoothing out the corners. "That legal protection only applies to residential zones. It applies to homes." I stepped forward, looking down at the map of the property I had bought 30 years ago. I remembered the day I bought this land. I remembered the tax code. I remembered how much I hated paying property taxes on a vacation home I only used 2 weeks a year. "Tiffany," I said, my voice low, "do you know why I leased this place to Brandon for $1 a year?" "Because you wanted to avoid gift taxes," she snapped. "Everyone knows that." "That was part of it," I admitted. "But there was another reason. A reason you never bothered to check because you were too busy picking out curtains. To save money on the annual property tax assessment, I never zoned this land as residential." I pointed to the stamp in the bottom right corner of the blueprint. It was dated 1990. The seal of the County Zoning Commission was faded but legible. "Read the classification," I said. Tiffany looked down. Her eyes narrowed. She read the words out loud, her voice faltering. "Commercial Zone C4, Special Purpose Facility." She looked up at me, confusion warring with panic. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, leaning in close, "that in the eyes of the county, the state, and the IRS, this building is not a house. It never has been. It is a commercial facility. Specifically, it is registered as the Caldwell Hydrological Research Outpost." I gestured to the lake outside the window. "We monitor water levels. We test for sediment. That is why the property taxes are so low. That is why the company owns it, not me personally. And that is why your lease was a commercial operating agreement, not a residential rental contract." Harper stepped in to deliver the final blow. "You aren't tenants, Tiffany. You are independent contractors who were permitted to sleep on the job site for security purposes. And since your contract was terminated for cause, specifically for embezzlement and corporate sabotage, your right to be on the premises ended the moment Harrison fired you." I watched the realization wash over her. The loophole she thought she had found was actually a noose. So I continued, my voice hardening. You are not residents protected by eviction laws. You are disgruntled former employees trespassing in a secure commercial facility after business hours. And in a high-security research outpost containing sensitive corporate data, trespassing is a criminal offense. I turned to the FBI agents who were still waiting by the door, having handed off Richard and Linda to the local deputies outside. Agents, I said, these two individuals are unauthorized personnel in a federal crime scene. They are trespassing on commercial property. Please remove them immediately. No, Tiffany screamed, backing away, knocking over a lamp. This is my house. My clothes are upstairs. My jewelry. You can't do this. I can, and I am, I said coldly. Anything you left in this facility is now considered abandoned corporate property, pending an audit. You leave with what you are wearing, nothing else. One of the agents stepped forward, his face impassive. Ma'am, you need to come with us. Now. Tiffany lunged for her purse on the sofa. The agent was faster. He blocked her path. Leave it, ma'am. She looked at me, her eyes, wild tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. Harrison, please, she begged, her pride finally breaking under the weight of the snow and the silence. It is freezing outside. I have nowhere to go. I have no money. You can't throw me out in a blizzard. I looked at her silver dress. I looked at the spot where the soup had stained the fabric. I remembered the badge. I remembered the humiliation. You have a coat, I said, pointing to the fur she had discarded on the chair when she arrived. Take it. It is more than you gave me when you sent me out into the storm. Brandon didn't even fight. He stood up slowly, looking like a ghost. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Tiffany. He just walked toward the door, his head hanging low, a broken man accepting his exile. Tiffany screamed as the agent took her arm. She thrashed, grabbing the doorframe, her fingernails digging into the wood. But it was useless. They hauled her out through the foyer, past the grand staircase she loved so much, and out into the biting cold of the night. I followed them to the door. I watched as the agents escorted them to the edge of the property line, right past the heated driveway, and left them standing on the public road. The snow was falling heavily now. The wind was howling. They stood there in the dark, shivering, the lights of the house they used to rule glowing warmly in the distance, unreachable. They were alone. They were broke. And they were freezing. I stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the cold air on my face. It felt cleansing. I looked at Harper. She was closing her briefcase. It is done, she said softly. Not quite, I said. I reached out and grabbed the heavy iron handle of the front door. I looked at the darkness where my son and his wife were disappearing into the storm. Goodbye, I whispered. And then, with a heavy final thud that echoed through the empty house, I slammed the door shut. The lock clicked. The silence returned. The parasites were gone. The observer was finally the only one left standing. The foyer of the lake house had become a theater of total collapse. The silence that had reigned for a few seconds after I ordered the eviction was now shattered by the chaotic, ugly sounds of a dynasty imploding. I stood by the grand staircase, my hand resting on the polished banister, watching the people who had tried to bury me get dragged into the night. It wasn't dignified. There was no stoic acceptance of fate. It was a brawl. Richard was fighting the cuffs, his face a mask of purple rage, twisting his body to shout at his wife. You greedy witch, he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. This was your idea. You said the old man was brain dead. You said he wouldn't notice. Linda shrieked back at him, her voice cracking, sounding like tearing metal. Me? You are the one who set up the shell company, Richard. You are the one who said we could take it all. Don't you dare pin this on me. They were hauled out the door, still screaming accusations at each other. Their marriage dissolving the moment the money disappeared. They were rats in a sack, biting and clawing as they were carried away. Then there was Tiffany. She wasn't screaming. She was looting. In the chaos of her parents' arrest, she had made a desperate dash for the coat closet. She wasn't grabbing a coat for warmth. She was grabbing bags. I watched as she stuffed a limited-edition designer handbag with silverware from the dining room table. She was grabbing anything that glittered, anything she thought she could pawn. She made it 3 steps toward the door before a female FBI agent stepped in her path. Tiffany tried to dodge, clutching the bag to her chest like a shield. "That is mine," she hissed. "It is my property." The agent didn't argue. She simply reached out and took the bag. "No, ma'am," the agent said, her voice flat and bored. "The bag was purchased on a corporate credit card 3 months ago. The contents are corporate assets. This is evidence in a federal embezzlement investigation." Tiffany lunged for it, her fingernails clawing at the leather, but the agent pushed her back with a firm, practiced motion. Tiffany stumbled, her heels slipping on the polished floor. She fell hard, landing in a heap of silk and desperation. She looked up at me, her mascara running in black streaks down her face, her eyes wide, with the realization that she was leaving with absolutely nothing. Not a dime. Not a diamond. Just the cold realization that she had played the game and lost everything. The agents pulled her up and escorted her out, her sobbing echoing until the heavy door cut it off. Then there was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that filled the massive house. The agents had cleared the room. Harper stood by the fireplace watching the flames, giving us a moment of privacy. It was just me and Brandon. My son was still sitting on the floor where he had collapsed. He looked small. He looked like a child who had broken a window and was waiting for the punishment. He slowly got to his knees, then pushed himself up, but he didn't stand. He stayed on his knees. He shuffled forward across the carpet, moving toward me like a penitent approaching an altar. "Dad," he whispered, his voice broken and hollow. I looked down at him. I tried to find the little boy I had taught to fish. I tried to find the young man I had sent to college, but all I saw was a stranger in an expensive suit that he hadn't paid for. "Dad." "Please," he said, reaching out to grab the hem of my trousers. "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. They tricked me. Richard and Tiffany, they told me it was a good investment. They told me you were sick. They said we had to do it to save the company." He was crying now, ugly, racking sobs that shook his shoulders. "I am your son, Dad. I am your flesh and blood. You can't let them take me. You can't let me lose everything. I was just trying to make you proud. I wanted to show you I could make a big deal." I looked at his hand clutching my pant leg. It was shaking. I felt a pang in my chest, a deep, ancient ache. It wasn't pity. It was grief. I was grieving the son I thought I had. I was grieving the illusion that blood was thicker than greed. I stepped back, pulling my leg away from his grasp. He fell forward, catching himself on his hands, staring up at me with wet red eyes. "Stand up, Brandon," I said, my voice cold and flat. He scrambled to his feet, wiping his face with his sleeve, a flicker of hope sparking in his eyes. He thought I was relenting. He thought the old man was softening. "Dad, thank you," he blubbered. "I knew you would understand. We can fix this. We can testify against them. I will help you." I looked him in the eye. The spark of hope in his gaze died instantly when he saw the look on my face. There was no warmth there. There was only the hard gray of steel. "You aren't going to prison, Brandon," I said. He let out a breath, his shoulders sagging in relief. "Oh, thank God. Thank God. I am not sending you to prison because you are my son." I continued, my voice not wavering. "And because, frankly, you are too stupid to survive in federal lockup. You weren't the mastermind, Brandon. You were the tool. You were the hammer they used to break my window." He nodded eagerly. "Yes, exactly. I was the tool. I was used." But I said, raising a finger to stop him. "A tool that breaks the hand that holds it gets thrown away." Brandon froze. What? You say you are my son, I said, stepping closer to him. But a son protects his father. A son protects his mother's memory. I saw the video, Brandon. I saw you stand there and watch your wife slash your mother's portrait. I saw you drink my whiskey while they planned to lock me in a padded room. You didn't stop them. You didn't call me. You signed the papers. I didn't mean to, he pleaded. Intent doesn't matter, I said. Actions matter. And your actions have consequences. You defaulted on the loan. The shares are mine. The company is mine. I turned and walked to the desk in the corner of the room, picking up a document Harper had prepared. I walked back and held it out to him. What is this? He asked, his hands trembling as he took it. It is a press release, I said. It goes out tomorrow morning. He looked down at the paper, reading the bold headline. Caldwell and Sons announces corporate restructuring and rebranding. He looked up, confused. Rebranding. Read the next line, I said. Effective immediately, he read, his voice barely a whisper. The entity formerly known as Caldwell and Sons will be dissolved and its assets transferred to a new charitable entity, the Caldwell Foundation. He looked at me, horror dawning on his face. Foundation. But that means... It means the family business is over, Brandon, I said. There is no Caldwell and Sons anymore. There is no legacy for you to inherit. There are no shares for you to claim. Every dime, every brick, every machine now belongs to a trust dedicated to vocational training for underprivileged youth. You are giving it away, he gasped. You are giving my inheritance away. It was never your inheritance, I said, my voice rising for the first time. It was my work, and I am choosing to use it to build men who know the value of $1 instead of giving it to a man who would trade his father for a sports car. But I have nothing, Brandon cried. Tiffany took the cash. The accounts are frozen. I have a mortgage on the city condo. I have car payments. That sounds like a personal problem, I said. You are a young man, Brandon. You have 2 hands. You have a college degree I paid for. Figure it out. I walked past him toward the door where Harper was waiting. I stopped and looked back. He was standing in the middle of the empty room, looking small and broken amidst the wreckage of the party. By the way, I said, the locks on the condo are being changed in an hour. That property belongs to the company, and since you are no longer an employee, housing is no longer provided. Dad, please, he begged, taking a step toward me. Where am I supposed to go? I don't know, I said, opening the door to the cold night air. But I hear the Motel 6 down the mountain has vacancies. They take cash. I walked out into the snow, leaving my son alone in the house he thought he owned, with nothing but the echo of his own bad choices to keep him company. The punishment wasn't prison. The punishment was reality. And for a man like Brandon, reality was a life sentence. The heavy oak door clicked shut, severing the connection between the warmth of the foyer and the biting wind outside, but the silence that followed was louder than the storm. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel crowded. It didn't feel suffocated by the perfumes of people who didn't belong, or the noise of conversations that meant nothing. It felt vast. It felt still. I stood there for a long moment, my hand lingering on the brass lock, listening to the house settle. The furnace hummed in the basement. The ice on the roof shifted and cracked. These were the sounds of a home breathing again after holding its breath for too long. I turned and walked back into the living room. The debris of their celebration was still scattered everywhere. The shattered glass near the fireplace, the spilled champagne soaking into the rug, the half-eaten trays of hors d'oeuvres that had cost more than a month's rent in my old room. It looked like a battlefield, but to me it looked like victory. I walked over to the bay window and looked out at the lake. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a pristine white blanket covering the world. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting a silver light on the water. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. For months I had been afraid of this moment. I had been terrified of being alone in this big house haunted by the ghost of my wife and the failure of my family. I thought the silence would crush me. I thought I would feel the crushing weight of loneliness that comes when you realize your bloodline ends with you. But as I stood there watching the moonlight dance on the ice, I didn't feel lonely. I felt light. I felt a profound sense of relief, as if a heavy cancerous growth had been surgically removed from my back. The parasites were gone. The leeches had been salted and burned. I was the observer, yes, but I was also the survivor. And for the first time since Martha died, I felt like I could breathe without pain. I saw a movement in the corner of my eye down by the front gate. A dark shape huddled against the stone pillar, shivering in the snow. It was Brandon. He hadn't left. He was standing there freezing, waiting for me to change my mind. He was waiting for the dad who always fixed everything to open the door and let him back into the warmth. He was waiting for the bailout. I sighed, a puff of steam escaping my lips, even in the warm house. I couldn't leave it like this. Not because I was soft, but because the lesson wasn't finished. A lesson isn't just punishment. It is instruction. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small white business card. I had carried it with me for 20 years, a reminder of where I came from. I walked to the front door and opened it one last time. The cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Brandon looked up. His face was blue, his teeth chattering violently. He was hugging himself, trying to preserve body heat in his expensive thin suit. When he saw me, he took a step forward, his eyes filling with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Dad," he stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "I knew it. I knew you wouldn't. Please, it is so cold. Let me in." I stepped out onto the porch, blocking the entrance. I didn't step aside. I didn't offer him a coat. I held out the card. "Take this," I said. Brandon reached out with a trembling hand and took the small rectangle of cardstock. He looked at it, confused. What is this?" he asked. "It is a phone number," I said. "It belongs to a man named Jim Miller. He is a foreman on a hydraulic dam project in North Dakota. I worked with his father. He owes me a favor." Brandon stared at the card as if it were written in a foreign language. "North Dakota," he whispered. "They are pouring concrete through the winter," I said, my voice cutting through the wind. "It is brutal work. 12 hours a day, sub-zero temperatures. Your hands will bleed. Your back will feel like it is breaking every single morning. The pay is $15 an hour, and you sleep in a trailer on the site." Brandon looked at me, horror dawning on his face. "You want me to pour concrete?" "I want you to become a man," I said. "You have spent your whole life spending money you didn't earn, living in houses you didn't build, and wearing suits you didn't pay for. You skipped the struggle, Brandon. And because you skipped the struggle, you have no character. You have no spine." I pointed at the card in his hand. "Jim needs a mud mixer. It is the lowest job on the site. But it is honest work. If you can survive 6 months out there, if you can learn what it feels like to earn $1 with your own sweat, maybe you will understand why I did what I did tonight." "But Dad," he cried, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I have nothing. How do I even get there?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a roll of cash. I peeled off $200, enough for a bus ticket and a sandwich. I handed it to him. "Figure it out," I said. "That is the first test." He took the money, looking at the 2 bills as if they were an insult. "And Brandon," I added, my voice dropping to a low, hard register, "do not call me. Do not write to me. And do not ever call me Dad again until you can show me a pay stub that you earned with your own 2 hands. Until then, you are just a stranger who shares my last name. Now go, before you freeze to death." He stood there for a long moment, looking at the house, looking at me, and finally looking at the card. He realized there was no negotiation. There was no safety net. The bank of Dad was closed forever. He turned slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and began the long walk down the driveway toward the main road. I watched him go until he was just a shadow in the darkness, a small broken figure trudging through the snow toward a bus station and a hard reality. I turned back to the house. I stepped inside and closed the heavy door. This time I threw the deadbolt. The metallic clunk echoed through the foyer, a final punctuation mark on the sentence of my past life. I was alone. But for the first time, alone didn't mean lonely. It meant free. I walked back into the living room. The fire was dying down, casting a soft orange glow on the walls. I walked over to the corner where Tiffany had thrown the painting of Martha. It was lying face down on the floor. I knelt, my old knees popping, and gently lifted it. The canvas was slashed right through her face, a jagged tear that marred her beautiful smile. But as I looked at it, I didn't see the destruction. I saw the woman who had stood by me when we had nothing. I saw the woman who would have been horrified by what our son had become, but who would have been proud of what I did tonight. I carried the painting over to the mantel and propped it up. I would have it restored. There were experts for that, just like there were ways to restore a life that had been slashed apart. I walked to the desk where Richard had left the bottle of my 50-year-old whiskey. He had left the cap off. The Philistine. I poured a small amount into a clean glass. The amber liquid swirled, catching the light of the fire. I walked to the window and raised the glass toward the reflection of the empty room, toward the painting of Martha, toward the future that was finally mine to write. Happy New Year. Martha, I whispered, the warmth of the scotch hitting my throat. The house is clean. The rats are gone. And I think for the first time in a long time we are going to be okay. I took a sip, savoring the burn, and watched the snow cover the tracks in the driveway, erasing the evidence that they had ever been here at all. The screen of my life faded to black, leaving only the sound of the wind and the peace of a man who had finally taken back his throne. The years that followed were quiet but fulfilling. I turned the lake house into a retreat for the foundation, a place where young apprentices could come to learn not just the trade, but the ethics of hard work. The laughter that now fills these halls is genuine, earned by sweat and shared purpose, not bought with stolen credit. I still think about Brandon sometimes, usually when the wind howls down from the mountain pass. I heard through the grapevine that he stuck it out in North Dakota for 2 years. He didn't call, and I didn't reach out. He needed the silence as much as I did. Rumor has it he's now a foreman himself, running a small crew in Montana. Maybe one day he'll knock on my door again, not as a beggar, but as a man. Until then, I wait and I build. Because in the end, we are not defined by what we own, but by what we build and who we become when everything else is stripped away. The Observer badge still sits on my desk, a plastic reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply watch, wait, and when the time is right, take back your life. Sometimes the hardest part of love is knowing when to stop giving. We spend our lives trying to shield our children from the harshness of the world, thinking we are helping them, but often we are just crippling them. I learned the hard way that you cannot buy respect, and you cannot inherit character. By stripping my son of his unearned privilege, I gave him the only thing of value I had left, to give a chance to build his own self-worth from the ground up. It is a brutal lesson, but a necessary one. If you protect a man from every storm, he will never learn how to build a shelter. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever felt taken for granted, or had to make a tough decision to protect your own dignity, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me share these stories with more people. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have given him the job lead, or would you have just closed the door? I read every single comment. Stay strong and never let anyone treat you like an observer in your own life.